what are the past achievements and where are we actually heading toward the future. See if I can get my map.
Next one.
Yeah. So, the question for this morning's session is the following. Defining the research agenda in medical education based on the highlights of the past. Is there consensus between two of the giants in our field? Let me just begin to tell you a little bit about Karolinska Institutet for those of you who may or may not know about it. Karolinska Institutet is a rather small medical school in northern part of Europe in Sweden, and it's very well known for its biomedical research and of course being connected to the Nobel Prize really makes Karolinska Institutet a pretty well known institution around the world. Now, if you were to look into the international rankings, you have to remember that Sweden is a quite small country with only 9 million inhabitants, and being one of the top 100 universities in the world is quite good actually for such a small country. And you can see here on the most recent rankings how Karolinska actually does. Karolinska has 5 Nobel laureates over the years, and you see them all here. It's only 4 prizes though, but we have 5 laureates, and whether or not it's good, that the last time was from 1982, so it's really getting a little bit dated, so hopefully we will produce more Nobel laureates for the future. Now, if you thought that Karolinska only was about the Nobel Prize, you're absolutely wrong. This gentleman, he is Gunnar Höglund and his wife Anna-Stina Malmborg. They decided, they don't have any children, and they decided to donate a huge amount of money, not to cancer research, not to research in any other medical domains, but to medical education. So what happened back in 2001 was that Karolinska Institutet, together with these 2 founders, established a new prize for research in medical education. We do have today, I think I can see Stefan somewhere. Stefan Lindgren is one of the members on the panel, on the prize committee, and we also have Madalena Patricio, I think she's here, is also on the prize committee for this very prize. What we're going to do today is that we're going to listen to a conversation between 2 of the not the Nobel laureates, but the laureates or recipients of this Karolinska Institutet award. And this year, because it's a biannual, this award is given out once every 2 years. And at the AMEE meeting this year, the winner of this, or the recipient of this year's award will be announced. And I know the decision has been made, and I know that Patricio as well as Stefan are absolutely tied up about who actually is the recipient this very year. So we'll see. If you come to AMEE, you will see. Now, this gives you a little bit of a flavor of the annual academic award ceremony in the Stockholm City Hall. That's also the city. That's also the place where you see the Nobel Prize be the party actually of the Nobel Prize every year. Let me just introduce you to the reasons why Professor Ronald Harden and why Professor Geoff Norman received the prize. It reads the following. Professor Ronald Harden received the prize back in 2006, and it says, the Karolinska Institutet Prize Committee has recognized Professor Ronald Harden as an innovative researcher in medical education and a prolific thinker. His ideas have been tested and put into practice in medical schools around the world. He has made and continues to make outstanding contributions to the broad field of medical education, particularly in the areas of assessment methods, curriculum design, and evidence and information technology-based medical education. His scientific work has promoted excellence in medical education worldwide. 2008, Professor Geoff Norman was the recipient of the award, and this is the motivation from the prize committee. Karolinska Institute's prize committee sees Professor Geoff Norman as a highly original and innovative researcher in the field of medical education. His research has had a significant impact on our understanding of the development of expertise in clinical medicine. Furthermore, his research has yielded important contributions to our knowledge of the complexity of pattern recognition, clinical reasoning, and clinical problem solving. His experimental studies are not only theoretically rigorous and well designed, but also situated in contexts that are theoretically and practically meaningful. Dr. Norman has profound methodological understanding of various research traditions, including statistical methods and advanced psychometrics. His scientific originality and insights extends into numerous related areas of medicine and cognition, in particular areas such as assessment of learning outcomes and clinical performance, visual perception and curriculum design. He has supervised numerous junior researchers, many who have become prominent scholars. Dr. Norman's studies has provided a deep insight into research-based reforms in medical curricula worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our two panelists today, Geoff Norman and Professor Ronald Harden.
Put this together.
Yeah, you can do it in 1 minute. Now, those of you who follow the literature might remember that back in 2011, Kevin Eva, who actually was one of Professor Norman's former PhD students, is editor-in-chief of medical education, wrote an editorial called The Shoulders of the Giants. This particular issue of medical education was produced for two reasons. One was to celebrate the accomplishments of the three first recipients of the Karolinska Award, and the second one was to pay tribute to them, and I quote now Kevin Eva, who says, for providing the shoulders onto which many of us try to climb, end of quote. What they did in this issue of medical education was there was a series of articles called History from those who wrote it. Today, we're not going so much to look into history in general. We're going to look into what are the 5 most important achievements in medical education research over the last 5 decades. So what we've done, we asked these two giants to actually address this issue, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not there is consensus. So, Professor Harden, would you like to start?
The computer. We had a fight whose computer we would use, and Geoff was happier using his computer. So if anything goes wrong with technology, it's his fault, not mine.
PhD in nuclear physics has to buy you something.
So it's a delight to be here on this platform, sharing it with Geoff, who I've admired his work, and I think Jonas has given us a very fascinating challenge, and clearly all we can give is a whirlwind tour of our responses. So I've picked what, in my view, in response to Jonas's question, what were the 5 most important achievements? And I've suggested these 5 topics as things that I think are significant achievements in these decades. For each one, I very quickly, and I don't do it justice, but I've said why, what impact has that had on medical education? You know, why have I put that as one of my 5? And then, because this is a little bit about research, I very quickly added at the end, I could have gone on much longer, but a quick insight from that perspective about research in medical education. So here we go. So what is the first achievement? Well, you've probably guessed that it's the objective structured clinical examination. More than 1,200 papers written, first described 75. It featured at all the Ottawa conferences, the most recent one, there were several sessions. And it's, as all we know, a performance assessment tested around a series of multiple stations. And I think the impact, and this actually is a quote from an earlier paper by Jeff on the performance assessment. I think the impact is that it's recognized, particularly way back in the 70s, that doctor skills, clinical skills and attitudes can be assessed as well as their knowledge. There was some concern, were we only measuring knowledge? And although, as Jeff has mentioned, that's important, can we also measure clinical skills? And I think that the second impact it's had is that the notion of the multiple stations, that isn't just one sample of competence, you need to measure multiple samples of competence. So that's impact. The insight I've had is that there are good and there are bad OSCEs, and the reliability is not built into the OSCE, it's built in how you do the OSCE. In fact, at an Ottawa conference, I gave a paper, the OSCE is a POSCE. It's a potentially objective structured clinical exam. So the insight in something works depends on who's doing it, and that's an interesting insight into research. So moving on to my second achievement, rather differently, I put student-centered learning, the notion of personalized learning, adapting the learning to the needs of the individual student, students' engagement in the medical school, students taking responsibility for their own learning. After all, they have to do that after they qualify. And the Aspire initiative, there's some leaflets outside of the AMEE stand, indeed selected this notion of students' engagement with the curriculum as one of the areas we're measuring excellence in assessment. And this will be, I think, one of the other sessions at this meeting. The impact, I think the big impact of this discussion is that students become partners in the learning process. They're not a separate animal. It's not us as the teachers and the students as the learners. Students have to become partners in the learning process. The insight here I've had looking at some of the work on student-centered learning is that we often miss out the word of motivation. Many of the research studies lack taking into account of motivation. So it's how do we motivate the students to get more involved in the learning? The third, I think, important trend, and one that a number of workers have said, in fact, is the most important change in education in the last decade, is outcome-based education. A move from an emphasis on process, for example, on how are we giving lectures and integration, to product. What is it we expect our students to learn? Some of the original book by Spady on this topic. And I think the impact has been that a very important one, we now see much greater discussion. It gives us a vocabulary that we can have a dialogue, a powerful catalyst for change in those considered with the continuum of education, those looking at integration, those looking at international collaboration and student-centered learning. These things will only happen if we are clearly specifying what we're trying to do, what we expect our students to learn. So I think it will be the impact on these change that outcome-based education will have. And I think an insight is that we don't necessarily need research before we can start going down a certain line. If we're thinking of collaboration across different phases, then it's very important, without necessarily doing research, that we need to know what each phase is trying to cover, that patient safety should be in our curriculum, and so on. And of course, research will show how we should do it. And my fourth is the use of new learning technologies, the digital native, the simulation, and some of our AMEE courses are now delivered online. And I think the impact here is that I think it is revolutionized how students are learning. If we look at our own schools, how they are learning, and in particular how they are learning clinical skills, that when they qualify, when they graduate, many of them have shown they have a full demonstration of clinical skills on the technologies available. So I think it's had a big impact on how students are learning. I think the insight, and I had an article, The Caged Bird or the Soaring Eagle, but I think we're too reluctant to look outside the box. We use these technologies just to do better what we're already doing, the caged bird, and not to do outside things, to do new things, to revolutionize education, the notion of the soaring eagle. We should be looking to adapt these technologies to new ideas. And the final and the last thing, and this was the one perhaps I had most difficulty putting in my last place in the list. There's a number of candidates, and I chose finally interprofessional education. Here I just put up the definition from WHO. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It's two or more professionals learning from and with each other to enable effective collaboration and improve health care. There was a whole symposium on this, whole meeting, the 3-day conference in Malaysia in March, and it was really a very exciting conference. And I think the impact here is that there is some evidence now that IPE can lead to better understanding of the work of other healthcare professions. So if we go through IPE, we now understand what other professions are doing, and there is some evidence, although it's still a lot to be done in the area, that it can actually lead to improved patient care and fewer errors in practice. I think my insight into the research side here is that sometimes an obsession with randomized control trials is not helpful. The Cochrane were going to do a search with randomized control trials. They found 2,000 papers in IPE, and there wasn't a single one that met their criteria. And they said, therefore, we can say nothing about IPE. And I think that's not a very helpful notion. But also, I think in IPE, if one looks at the research, it's the details of implementation that matter as much. So I very quickly summarize what I see as the most significant developments for me in medical education. Of course, the OSCE, clinical assessment, the notion of giving the power to the student-centered learning, the notion of outcome-based education, which is a marvellous vocabulary that allows us to have a dialogue in the different stakeholders, the use of new learning technology to do new things and not just better what we're already doing. And the exciting idea that here we are working as a team on interprofessional education. Thank you.
Well, this is getting